Prescribed fire can maintain or alter ecosystems, create or destroy habitat, promote wildlife populations or livestock populations, control weedy plants or liberate native species, restore ecosystems, and even meet important sociocultural needs. And after a century or more of repression, fire use and management is experiencing a renaissance in the world. There's a huge diversity in prescribed burning purposes, principles, policies, and practices that can serve to incentivize and inform fire use around the world. In this webinar series, we present a survey of prescribed fire from around the globe, focused on 7 broad topic areas: fuel management, rangeland and landscape management, management of production forests, wildlife management, monitoring and data sets, ecological restoration, and cultural burning. Today's webinar is the first in our series, and it is entitled A Worldwide View of the Roles, Status, and Future of Prescribed Fire. Before we begin, I'd like to express our thanks to our supporters and sponsors. Our webinar series is organized by the California Prescribed Fire Monitoring Program, which is a collaboration between the California Department of Forestry and Fire Protection and the Safford Lab at the University of California, Davis. The program collects data and conducts analyses on the effectiveness and impacts of managed fire. We'd specifically like to thank the California Fire Science Consortium and their funders, the U.S. Joint Fire Science Program and CAL FIRE, for help with advertisement, coordination, and registration, the University of California, Davis for IT help, and the Catalan Fire Service for help in securing some of our speakers. We also want to thank Josep Seta, an artist in Catalonia who has composed a piece of art for each of our webinars based on the webinar theme. You can see today's piece on the California Fire Science Consortium website. And finally, sincere thanks to Ruth Domenech, the technical coordinator of the California Prescribed Fire Monitoring Program, who developed the amazing idea for this international webinar and did most of the work to make it happen as well. Ruth will now introduce today's topic and our speakers. Thanks.
Thanks, you. Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, even good night, depending on where you are joining us. It's a pleasure to host this webinar today. I am Ruth Domenech, and I'm coordinating the California Prescribed Fire Monitoring Program. However, my background involves working in both the cold and wet highlands of Scotland and also the hot and dry forests of the European Mediterranean. Our monitoring program in California consists of almost 40 sites with over 1,000 plots to evaluate the effectiveness of prescribed fires. We aim to present our database as a knowledge hub that can expand and connect with other regions of the world. Climate change and extreme wildfires are evolving fast, which pose significant challenge to us. To keep up, we need to learn fast, and so on. We need to connect knowledge globally to increase learning locally. By applying questions from other regions to our area, we will learn a lot and fast. But we also have to recognize the vast knowledge of the traditional practices and indigenous people that has been disregarded over the years. This knowledge is still present in Europe and South America and has never stopped. Today's first webinar will discuss prescribed fire roles in ecosystems, connections to culture and community, best practices and insights for the future. And we will set the framework for the upcoming webinars. Today, we have people registered from all over the world. We have 382 people registered. Now we are almost 100 people. And from various professions, interests, backgrounds. But we want to sincerely thank our 4 high-level speakers today for making this possible. Thank you very much. Before we begin, there are a few technical issues to address. The webinar is being recorded, you see that, and it will be available on the California Fire Science Consortium website approximately a week after the webinar date. Today, each speaker will have 20 minutes, and then we will follow with 15 minutes for questions. We have a unique channel for questions. You can type your questions there. We will not take verbal ones. And at the end, we will choose a selection of them to ask the speakers. So please include the name of the speakers, that you are addressing or indicate if it's for all of them. We have a translation of the last speech by Luisa Alfaro. You will have that available on the down in your bar. There is an interpretation tab, and you will have to initiate this channel. It's not you. If you want the translation, you will have to go there. Also, I want to say that for next webinars, we will have also transcription for several languages. So after all of that, it's been a bit challenging to coordinate 5 different time zones, but we could do that. So thank you for all of you for the effort. And with that, I would like you to introduce our first speaker. He's Marc Castellnou. He's an incident commander in Catalonia, Spain, and has been working extinguishing fire for more than 30 years, but also introducing prescribed fire in Europe again. He will speak about the challenges for fire service and urban society to bring back the use of fire for its cultural use and extreme fire prevention. So Marc, thank you. The floor is yours.
Thanks. I'll share my screen.
This is what we see.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks for inviting us. We as a Catalan fire service, we started this trip into the prescribed burning program 26 years ago. I mean, Catalonia, as the rest of Europe, has been using prescribed fire for millennia, but just at more or less the beginning of the last century, we started to change our policy to firefighting, and then back in the 90s, we decided it was time to bring it back again and make it part of our way of managing wildfires in a highly populated area. We are a 3 million hectares country with almost 8 million people living in it, but almost 20 million people during the summertime. So it's a highly crowded area where we have a lot of people living with fire. So our prescribed burning program looks more or less, a lot of the areas are really dry forests like in California, and being able to share data and to see how this database evolves and how this database can help us to answer questions is important. So I will just present some of the questions we have and some of the lessons we've learned in the last years. And those are the things we can share. As Ruth has said, it's important that we speed up the knowledge and the learning process about the use of fire globally. And the only way to do that is just sharing experiences from everywhere. So that's our recent history in prescribed fires, and that's the location of all our fires over there. Our prescribed fires areas in Catalonia, and more or less the history it's drafted on the right side of the slide. So in the 1400s, we already have legislation at the county level that regulate prescribed fire. But at the end of the 19th century, we started to get away from that cultural practices or that rural practices, because the Industrial Revolution had made possible that fire that has been used for millennia to get products out of the forest, like pastures or fruits or hunting, or a lot of differentiated by diverse products, was an enemy, because it was kind of affecting the product of the industrial factories, was timber. So that was the change, from fire to be a tool to get products out of the forest, fire to be the enemy. And that was in the society, in the media, in the newspapers, everywhere at the end of the 19th century. By 1905, we hit the maximum occupancy of our landscape. I mean, we were farming almost all our landscape. We got only almost between 5 and 8% of our landscape left as a forest. It was almost nothing. And then until after Second World War, things started to change. And by 1967, we established a policy of firefighting nationally, and we prohibited the use of fire in the forest. Then at the end of the 70s, the proper Catalan fire service was established. But at the moment it was established, forest was already back to 35%. So we were starting to leave the countryside to become a more urban society. By 83, the fire as a tool to fight fire was also prohibited because some burnout operations in wildfire burned houses and affected properties. So we became fighting fires with water and hand tools and not fire. By 93, we were starting to bring back the use of fire into the Pyrenees, into the convention, to keep the pastures open for our goats and cows, and that was the first regulation. And by the end of the 90s, after big wildfires, we bring back some experimental prescribed burning in the lowlands, and we created special units in the fire service, which is the graph unit into one I belong, to reintroduce prescribed fire. We were bringing back that knowledge from US, from the Wallowa-Whitman National Forest, but at the end, what we were doing is we were joining that knowledge from our grandfathers that were burning in our mountains for millennia. And then in 2006, the first official law was passed in our government, and in 2014, we started to let some fires burn in summer. By 2020, we were already almost 70% forest in the country. So in the last 30 years, we've gone from 35 to 70%. So we doubled the subfire. So it's imperative to apply prevention. And in 2022, the first private company started to apply prescribed fire. So it has been a long history. And one important thing you need to realize is that our forests are kind of short forests. So they are not really big trees. So that's a picture of the areas where we mostly burn. We also do a lot of burns in kind of chaparral or brushland country. But mainly, almost all our program was designed and intended initially as a training program. So the way we, as a fire service, we bring back forests into Europe, we bring back fire use in our forests in Europe, was because we need to train our firefighters to use fires to put out extreme wildfires. And doing that, we started the prescribed burning program with the different objectives, and we connected the gap between the 50s when we ended that culturally, and in the 90s when we started that to use again professionally. And doing that, we as a service connected the dots in Europe. We connected a lot with France, that was doing fire in the Pyrenees, with Portugal, that was one of the pioneering countries in Europe doing fire. And then we started to cooperate with them, training and exchanging experience, and becoming the training grounds for all other fire service in Europe that want to be trained and use fire, like Norway, England, Ireland, Netherlands, Italy, Greece, Germany, and also Poland. So that's how we started. It's how we bring back fire use into Europe, and how we just use that inside the fire service as a training opportunity for our firefighters. But now, after 26 years of experience, we can answer some questions that can reshape our prescribed burning program. And that's the importance of database like the one in California, because bigger database can allow us to answer the questions from different perspectives, or ask us different questions, or learn faster. So the main things are, if our goals are clear, what is leading our prescribed burning program, the importance of the burning season, the comparing mechanical treatments with burning treatments, and what's the future evolution of the program. So for us, the prescribed burning program goal is diverse. Mainly fuel management is the more important, is the one that gets almost the highest number of burns, but there's still pastures for creating grass for goats and cows, like was our cultural use of fire for millennia. It's still there. Forest management for silvicultures, it's important. Wildland interface, protection, research It's applied there in different projects, habitat restoration for biodiversity and training. So we started the program as a training program, but it evolves fast to a full management, but also recover the cultural use and added research, Wildland Fire, and Silvix and others. In terms of full management, we don't do a huge surface of burning. We do strategically burnings. I mean, that's an example of the Cap de Creus area, and where according to the pattern of spread of the fires with the Tramontana winds, we locate the burns in the areas where there are the bottlenecks for the fire to spread, and especially in that area is where you see the burns we do for full management, and that is how they look like. So as a fire service, we are targeting strategically the full management instead of making a lot of area burns. Another important lesson we learn is how public opinion is impacting our program. You can see the yearly evolution on the number of days we've burned. So we went up almost until 60 burn days. Now in last year, we hit almost 100 day burning days. But you can see that we had a problem between 2006 and 2011. So in 2006, we had a burn that we were accused of an escape. It means 5 days after the burn, a fire happened and couldn't be demonstrated, but the public opinion blamed the burn. And that drive a lot of pressure over the program and almost killed it out in 2009. So it is important to have that in mind. In a crowded area like Europe, you have to take into account the public opinion, explain that very well. What are you doing? Why are you doing? When are you doing? Because if not, if it's not understood, so a single rumor can kill your program out. Public opinion is also important in the goals, like we've seen before. As you can see in the left hand side, the full management, it accounts for almost 47% of our burns, and pastures only 20%. But if you go into surface, full management is 28%, and pastures is up to 46%. So it's a kind of inversion there. One thing is what we want to do, which is full management. The other thing is what our society culturally accepts, which is the ancestral knowledge of burning pastures. So we see what we are trying to do, but we see what we're achieving. And if you don't take into account just explaining to your society, you don't get your program running in the direction you want it to run. The other thing is the importance of the burn season. Burn season, it is important because it has ecological consequences. So traditionally, we burn prescribed fire on winter because it's safer and we don't get escape fire. And as you can see, January, February, March, April are the highest months. Then we go back to October, November, December. I compare the number of burns and the rain we get in Catalonia. As you can see, the summer is a dry, but we also get a dry January, February, and again November, December. So our rainy season mainly it's April, May, and September and October. But we use the winter season instead of the fall season. The only reason that is behind there, it is that we are a fire service, and at the beginning of the year, you get everybody with the new budget, all their hours available for the year. But at the end of the year, after the fire season, people are running out of hours, run out of availability, and it's not that easy to burn. So there is a fire service condition of when we burn mainly, and that's the one problem. The other problem is that we have learned through our experience that burning in summer, which is the traditional dry season and the traditional fire season, creates different effects than burning in winter, which is not the normal and traditional fire season for the last millennia. So we've seen those effects. And as you can see, this is an effect of burning on Weta. In 2014, we burned that area. We mainly cleared the brush, but 6 years later, in 2020, the brush has been sprouting and it's all there. But if we burn on summer, you can see that at the end of summer, we can see that the effects are really a lot better. And instead of increasing or favoring or helping the sprouting to occupy the land, we get a more grassland recovery. So burning, we've learned in our area that burning on winter, just it has an impact on the sprouters. You get more sprouts, and if you burn in summer, you affect the sprouters, and you get more the obligated cedars dominate the area. It's more grassland. So the effect on fuel reduction and the effect on pasture, it lasts longer if you burn that in summer in the hot season than instead of you burn that in the cold season. And that's important for the effects. And we realized in the last 25 years, burning in winter, because it's safer, we've been changing the ecosystems we're burning to be more dominated by brush than by grasslands. And that was not what we were intending. So now we have learned that we have to shift the burning season into summer, which is what we are not doing because our fire service issues that makes it easier to burn on winter. But that's a goal we have to go for. And that's another example of burning on summer. You can see the year after the nice open stand that we created, but in that one that we burn on winter, the coming back after 3 years is not that good. So if we want to get a healthy ecosystem, we need to burn on the historically fire season, which is the dry summer. That means June, July, August, September, October. So until the end of the hot summer. The other big question in our program is that we are using a lot of mechanical treatments, thinnings to improve the effects of our burnings. But we've been asking if that's exactly what we need to do or not. And some of the answers from our program are clear enough to say that it's better to do the mechanical treatment or the thinning after the fire than before the fire. And that's counterintuitive because we were applying the mechanical to make easier to burn and safer to burn. But as you can see in the picture, just burning in those conditions, it creates a lot more heat and temperature in the ground, and that creates different effects on the soil and the regeneration after the burn. And although a lot of the research is clear on the reduction of the fuel, it means there is a lot more fuel in the mechanical, because in the mechanical treatment, when you do it, just compact all the fuel on the ground, so you don't get that much difference when you compare the pre-burn or the pre-mechanical and the post-burn and the post-mechanical. So the data, when you use fuel load, is not conductive, and even tells you that thinning and burning, it can be better and faster than just burning first. But our evidence on the soil and the regeneration, like the example, and it shows that doesn't do burning in 2015, in 2018, as you can see, it was a too intense burn, and it's not even grass, not even sprouting there. It is not going well. On the other hand, when you burn without a mechanical treatment, that's how it looks like, and you get a lot of torching plots in the area, and it's not that easy to burn. So having that kind of flare up in the burn is not that easy. But at the end, what you get is this kind of burns. And one of the main criticism that we've been receiving in our burnings, it is that we don't create enough intensity to affect the stand structure and create kind of dynamical regeneration in our stands. So if we treat our sites to do the burns, we get a lot more homogeneous results, but we get a lot of intensity in the ground, but we don't affect the ground and we don't open anything. So if we burn without mechanical treatments, what we create is a lot better effect. So that's kind of the results we are getting and the things we can answer in our if we got a good database, and especially if we can compare that database with other places. And that's why I think it's important to bring the European experience, the South American experience, the African experience into what we can get out of the Californian experience. So we learn together. One important thing is where our program is moving to. So with our learning lessons learned, we have to go to burn summer. We have to go to make mechanical treatments after burning, not before burning. So that means that we have to apply prescribed fires during wildfires. That means we have to bring back the use of fire during wildfires and transform some of our wildfires into prescribed fires. And that's what that graph here is showing, where you see the prescribed burning. There was 100% of our use of fire, and now it's down to 40% of the surface we burn under prescription, because we're starting to let some fires burn to achieve some goals. So that's how we see the evolution in the next decades in Europe. We have a prescribed burning program. Once we use the learn lessons through our prescribed burning program, then we can start to apply the properly prescribed fire during the summer season, which is what research, at least in our area, it's pointing at. Thank you.
Thank you, Marc. Yeah, so thank you for your presentation. And we will now move to knowing the role of prescribed birds in ecosystems with Paulo Fernandes. He's a fire ecologist and fire behavior scientist. He's been studying fire worldwide, providing evidences of its beneficial impacts. He's from Portugal, a leading country in prescribed fire in Europe. So thank you a lot, Paulo, for joining us today. Good afternoon, and you can start when you can.
Hello, thanks for the invitation, and good morning or good afternoon or good evening. So I will try to give a general overview of prescribed fire in Europe. So I will try to introduce the context, then talk about scientific and technological achievements in these years, and then about the practice. Marc has already told us a lot about the practice in Catalonia. I will make it more generic, so try to characterize it at European level. So the context, I think we have two different contexts in the Mediterranean part of Europe. In the southern Europe, we used to have open landscapes maintained by various disturbances with low fire hazards. You can see this from these old photos. Then we had all these land use and land cover changes throughout the 20th century and continuing into the 21st century, the so-called forest transition, which is common to all of Southern Europe. And so we ended up with these landscapes, which are very fire-prone, under fire suppression policies, under ongoing climate change. And so now we are having these so-called mega fires. In Northern and Central Europe, the situation is a bit different, although they also had extensive afforestation programs. But the current situation there is more of trying to maintain or to revive traditional land management practices, which include the use of fire, and also for the use of fire to restore habitats and to increase biodiversity. One thing is certain, we have this problem in Southern Europe, but we are seeing signs it's extending northwards. So we have all these forests, all these plantations, and all these natural dynamics of forest recovery. And typically we blame fire on lack of management, lack of forest management. But what we are seeing is that managed or unmanaged, we see similar levels of fire behavior in these forests under the same or similar weather conditions. The issue here is that they are managed, but they are not managed for fire. So they don't really have a full treatments. And we are at a time where the ambitions of adapting or mitigating climate change through forestry are quite relevant, at least in Europe. But with these changes in fire regimes, we will not achieve that. And this is very easy to see from fire behavior simulations into the future, like here for pine forests in Portugal. So you can see that forecasts of fire spread rate and fire line intensity are much above the current or the historical norm. And even for the RCP 4.5, which is milder, there's not really a big difference from the RCP 8.5. So in terms of science and technology, we must consider what managers need and what researchers can produce to reply to those needs. So managers need to know why, or well, in fact, they know why, so they set their objectives, what and where, mostly depending on vegetation type, on spatial planning, and when and how. So it's a question of fire frequency or the frequency of the treatment, season, weather patterns, ignition patterns. Researchers, in a way or another, all these questions can be replied by studying or examining the basic things related with fire behavior and fire ecology and fire effects, and so usually this is the process through which scientists try to reply to these requests and to these questions. In Southern Europe, how did prescribed burning in terms of research and development evolved? So the first ideas or the first studies were in the more or less in the mid-1960s, 1970s. There was a strong influence from the US. There were relevant exchanges between people, namely from Florida, in Europe, especially in Portugal, but I believe also in Spain and France. And so there were all these exchanges in the 1970s. There were also good connections between researchers and the forest services in these Southern Europe countries. I give you this example from Greece, which, as far as I know, it's the first example of a prescribed burning study in Europe. And this is a bit, currently, Greece, it's a country where we don't have prescribed burning. So they were pioneers in terms of prescription development and so on, recommendations, but actually the practice never was implemented in Greece. We can distinguish more or less three phases in research efforts in Southern Europe. So first of all, because it was needed to give to legitimate the practice of prescribed burning, basic questions had to be answered. So mostly about prescribed burning, to develop, in terms of effects, to develop the first prescriptions in the 1980s. Then in the 1990s and afterwards, there were some European cooperative projects, first relatively small, later the big fire paradox projects, and more recently, the efforts have been more on planning and decision support data and tools. In terms of research on ecological effects and ecological impacts, a lot has been done, especially in forests, but also in shrublands. So here you just have a list of topics. So effects on fuels consumption, fuel dynamics after treatment, many studies about effects of fire on soils, focused especially on chemical and biological properties. But many of these studies were not really carried out under prescribed fire conditions. So people, even nowadays, they very often study the effects of experimental fires more in summer. And then many studies as well on the effects of fire on vegetation, composition, recovery, nutritive value for grazing, also the effects on trees, tree damage like crown scorch, tree mortality, tree growth, and finally effects on biodiversity, which is a topic more developed in southern France, in the Pyrenees, so studies about the effects of fire on birds and so on. Here you just see some illustrations. In general, the conclusions of all these studies is that the effects of prescribed burning are short-lived. So either we are referring to negative effects or to positive effects, especially when we talking about the effects on soils. The magnitude is extremely low and the effects disappear after a few months or a few years. And nonetheless, there are concerns about the fire regime or about specific components of the fire regime. Regarding tools for decision support and for planning, we always have these major option. We can go for an adoption or an adaptation or development of new tools and new systems. The tools developed in the US by the Forest Service are very popular in Europe, especially in Spain. And so people regularly use Behave Plus or other tools based on Rottermel's model. In other countries, people use the Canadian Fire Weather Index system, which is quite useful for some applications. And other countries or other places develop their burn guides and sometimes some software equivalents that are interesting because site-specific conditions and site-specific objectives can be addressed that cannot be addressed using other tools. Of course, these involve experimental field burning programs, which are very well suited for this approach. But of course, they are also very important to inform the other approaches because they can use to validate or to adapt the other approaches. Basically, people try to connect using fire experiments or operational burns. But the objective is to connect the fire environment with the fire behavior and with all the fire effects, including some delayed effects. Prescriptions in Europe. Now I will talk in both in the Mediterranean, in Northern Europe. So we have these qualitative prescriptions and burn thresholds which are very common in the UK and in Ireland. So here you see an example of Scotland with some simple indications, some figures, but also some qualitative indications. You see the prescribed burning code of practice of Ireland based on the Canadian fire weather system. Then you have burn intervals, and this is the most common approach in Europe. So all countries, all regions have, you can find these burn intervals, which are like simplified prescriptions in terms of minimums and maximum values and optimum ranges for variables. So you see here an example for Portugal, pine forest, for northwestern Spain, heathland, for Italy, grass heather or heather vegetation. Other burn intervals for mountain shrubland in France, in the Pyrenees, for coastal heathland in Germany, for Sweden, in Scots pine forests. So all these prescriptions are included in a guide that was developed some years ago for Europe. Yet another example, I just mentioned this one, it's from Portugal because it's based on the Canadian system, but it allows to map every day and for the next days, the areas of the country which are under optimum or marginal because too dry, or marginal because too wet and out of prescription across the country. This has limitations, of course, but it's a useful guide for planning. And finally, burn windows. And of course, we should go for burn windows because they are just not ranges in variables. We can develop these burn windows like the one you are looking at for Mediterranean shrubland, based on Behave Plus, for example. In this case, based in custom fuel models, so fuel models that are calibrated or validated with fire behavior observation. But better than that, you can have these site-specific burn windows because you can take into account local fuel, local stand conditions. You can design your burns to attain your quantitative objectives. And so these really require extended burning programs. In Portugal, we have these two tools, one for pine forest and other for eucalypt plantations. So you can see some evolution or some sequence in these sophistication in these approaches. I did not talk about traditional burning based on traditional ecological knowledge, which doesn't have a formal prescription, but it's an art by itself, and sometimes it can be quite sophisticated because it's based on unbounded burning, and you really need to know how to do that. But then you see a progression until you reach these more site-specific burn windows, which are more desirable because the emphasis it's on fire severity, on fire effects. So the emphasis it's on treatment objectives. Prescribed burning in Europe. Here you see an old map. This is more or less 15 years old. And you see the distribution by countries and by regions. So basically, where it's pink, there is no prescribed burning. I think this pattern more or less is current. And then where you see the lighter blue, it's mostly for fire hazard reduction or fuel reduction. When you see the darker blue, it's a combination for other hazard reduction plus other objectives. And yellow is more for biodiversity, nature conservation, so different objectives. We had no data for the British ISILs when we did this, but I will talk a bit later. Here you see, I tried to summarize. So you see the map of Europe with all the Köppen-Geiger climate types. So we can distinguish this region in the southwestern So prescribed burning in shrublands, in pine forests, at lower fire return intervals, so more frequent burns, typically larger operations, mostly for fuel reduction or for range management or both. Then you have the United Kingdom, fire in heathlands. The interval between burns, it's longer for ecological motives. They burn at the low end of fire weather, operations extremely small, and it's mostly for habitat management, especially for grouse. And then this particular case of Sweden, which perhaps it's more similar to what it's done in the Western United States. So prescribed fire in Scots pine, a longer interval between burns, mixed severity fires. So they usually intend to create some deadwood or to kill some trees. Burns are in the summer because usually they don't have conditions for fire outside summer, and it's mostly for biodiversity purposes. In terms of extent, Marc already told us this, but the area treated is low if we compare this with North America or Australia or even Brazil or other countries. France usually has the highest amount per year. Portugal can be similar sometimes. For Spain, I don't think I have the total data, the total amount of treated area, but it's below Portugal. And then you have Italy. You can notice this is a log scale, and so the treated area in Italy, it's still experimental. They do some burning, but it's not really a current practice there. My estimation per year on average, if we sum Southern Europe with the UK, maybe we are treating around 25,000 hectares per year. So it's not much, but locally it can be significant, and you can really see the marks on the landscape of prescribed burning in certain places, especially in France, in the Pyrenees. So you can see all these prescribed fire patches since 1983. And if you zoom, you really see this mosaic, an actual mosaic of prescribed burning, which is not common in Southern Europe. Some places in Portugal, like in this particular area, which is near my university. And then in Scotland, they have these particular patterns of very long strips and also very small. Of course, we cannot compare these maps. The scales are different. So in the case of France, it's more sub-regional or landscape. And here it's more like a portion of a landscape. I also like to think of these unplanned fires, so mostly pastoral burning, which by prescribed burning standards are under prescription. And if we count with these areas, which in these maps are what you see in yellow, they more than double prescribed burning extent in Portugal. Possibly in Spain, in some regions, we also have these effects. So these yellow areas are fires probably lit by shepherds. They are not authorized, but they are also not suppressed for one motive or other. And they are not recorded in the wildfire database, but the extent of area can be quite significant when you have a dry winter. And if you look at their characteristics in terms of fire weather index and burn size, they are not very different from prescribed burning. They tend to occur on the more marginal conditions, so they tend to self-extinguish, and they also have a longer tail here, so they tend to be smaller. This is just for 1 year, so 1 year of data. So in the future, when we work these data, maybe we find different patterns. So prescribed fires are small in Europe. Here you see a comparison between Portugal and Catalonia. Some differences, but in general, you see the prevalence of these fires between 1 and 10 hectares size. And if they are in forest, they are even smaller. And most of the area treated in Southern Europe, it's in shrubland or grassland. Although in certain regions, forest can be more important. The conditions under which these burns are carried out, if we take all the prescriptions in this handbook, and before I show you some examples, if you take all the prescriptions together, you see these statistical distribution in full moisture, relative humidity, temperature, and wind. So these conditions are different between forest and shrubland, but typically they are more conservative or more marginal than we would find in Australia or North America. How are prescribed fires managed in Europe? I won't go into this, but I recommend this book, which is relatively recent. It's a nice book. You will find 2 chapters, one about Northwestern Europe and the other about Mediterranean Europe, and it's very much focused on the management of these burns, how they are really carried out. Reducing the extent of wildfires or high severity fires or burned area in general is an important issue or objective in Southern Europe, but we don't really know much about this. So all the data we have, it's from Portugal. So it's the only place where studies have been carried out. In other places, you have anecdotal data or some case studies, but we know that it decreases forest fire behavior up to 10 years, decreases fire severity between 2 and 6 years in forest and up to 5 years in shrubland, and as a average between 0.2 worst case scenario and 0.8 in frequent fire landscapes. This means that per each hectare of prescribed burning that you treat, you are not reducing wildfire in the same amount. And in the worst case scenario, you need to treat 5 hectares to reduce wildfire by 1 hectare. Why this happens? Probably because our treatment effort is very low, even in the places where we burn more. So it can be just 0.5% of the landscape per year. Spatial planning is more random than strategic. It's more linear than based on areas or patches. And also we don't have a nice integration with firefighting operations, at least in Portugal. I suppose it can be better in other countries. To conclude, I just stress the importance of monitoring. And there's something in Portugal when I do training and talk with technicians and people involved, I always stress the importance of collecting data, which people don't usually like too much, and maintaining and curating the data, and especially if burns are repeated on the same place, same patch or same plot. And so this is extremely important, and Marc already mentioned it. So our knowledge is mostly based in single events, and we need to know more about the prescribed fire regime in terms of frequency, of season, of size. And this has important implications for carbon, for biodiversity, including for problems like invasion by alien plants, which can be a problem in certain regions. And so, thank you.
All right, thanks so much, Paulo. I think next up we have Morgan Varner from Tall Timbers.
Great. Can you see my screen okay?
I can, yes.
Great. Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you so much. And it's an honor to follow those two. My name is Morgan Varner. I'm going to talk a little bit about stewarding fire in the United States. And it's a really diverse story. We could spend an entire day on this topic, and I only have a few minutes. And so I will focus on the most probable. So let me jump in here. As many of you know, North America is a pretty fire-prone continent, and the conterminous United States, if you glance at the fire regimes of this landscape, you tend to see a pockmarked surface where the southeastern United States burned quite frequently and has the climate and the human history to burn quite frequently. The western United States and New England, quite diverse in their fire regimes, but also with areas of pretty extensive areas of really, really frequent fire. If you notice that scale there, this is PC2FM that many of you know, the late Rich Guyette and his colleagues generated. And this landscape, this palette is how prescribed fire and how fires are managed on this landscape. In the US, for a little context, wildland fire encompassing wildfires and prescribed fires, they're relatively equal in their annual extent. Wildfires are much more variable in their within year extent, somewhere between 2 and 6 million hectares. They're overwhelmingly concentrated in the western US, and prescribed fires tend to be much more similar year to year, and they are also concentrated, and they're focused more in the southeastern United States. In general, the West runs a ratio of about 10-to-1 wildfires to prescribed fires, and the Southeast runs the opposite, about a 10-to-1 prescribed fire hectare to wildfire hectare. The Coalition of Prescribed Fire Councils and Marc Melvin generated this map based on data from the individual 50 states. And what you can see pretty clearly is a few states jump out in prescribed fire extent. The Southeast you see is warm colored, and that means there's at least 250,000 acres in this case of prescribed fire annually. You see there in the middle, Kansas sticking out, as it often does, a place where a lot of fire happens in grasslands. And overwhelmingly in this landscape, you see that the Southeast dominates somewhere, depending on how you count them, 60 to 70% of annual prescribed fire extent is in that very small number of states. This fancy image that I just drew here is about 80% of U.S. prescribed fire within that red circle. Prescribed fire is relatively rare in the West and the Northeast. And an important characteristic of American prescribed fire is that we think that 84%, based on state level data that is relatively consistent, 84% is private and state lands. So it is not being dictated by federal land management agencies, as is often presented. So if you take that area in that blob, that red circle that I drew, and you start to drill in a little bit more, you can look at the hot spots of prescribed fire activity. I have two images here from a recent paper that Karen Cummins led using prescribed fire permit data from individual southeastern states. And you can see where the individual hot spots are. So on the left map, those brightly colored areas in the Florida Panhandle and really almost throughout the state of Florida are on public lands. And that represents National Forest lands, military lands, National Park Service, and National Wildlife Refuge lands. And those blobs across the Southeast really represent where public lands are located. Again, they're a somewhat minor component of the entire landscape. And if you look to the right, on that image, that's private lands. And there you see in some ways, in South Alabama, South Georgia, South Carolina, and most of through Florida, a background of relatively robust prescribed fire activity, and then some pretty dramatic hotspots. Those hotspots are located, that South Georgia, North Florida hotspot is the Red Hills where Tall Timbers is located, and other lands in East Alabama, South Georgia, South Carolina, and ranch lands in South Florida. To me, these are powerful images because in some ways people assume that, as in that previous map, that the Southeast is always on fire and everywhere is equally burned. You can see from this that the South is certainly not monolithic in where fire occurs, and I'll show you a little bit more on when. There are two images here that get at the hot moments of prescribed fire. On the left, that clock diagram shows where prescribed fire is taking place, or excuse me, when prescribed fire is taking place across the 13 southern states. What you see is as you move from January to February, the colors become a lot darker. And then you look at March, and this is over an 11-year period. And so you can see each of the years just how consistent that March burning window is across quite a large area, quite a bit of activity in April, and then it tapers off relatively quickly. And you see very little burning activity from July back around to November. That's a pretty consistent pattern, as you can see with the clock. And if you look to the right, those are that's a prescribed burn window analysis that Andy Chiotti, Sim Larkin, and I worked on. And that shows just how open those windows are for optimal prescribed fire conditions. Those conditions can vary by ecosystem, and so this ends up being a little more coarse. But if you look at the variation across these months, you can see that January, February, March window relatively wide open, April becoming slightly challenging, and then it tapers pretty quickly into May. And then across the top of that image, you see the constraints on that burn window, where it's relatively difficult to make burns happen. And so those challenges pervade a lot of management. Quite a bit of fire scar work done in the Southeast, and in some ways there had been a relatively slow attempt at getting fire scar data for the region. And part of that reason was that we just always assumed that it would show really, really frequent fire. And indeed, as we started to dig into old cut stumps or logs, we found really, really frequent fire, but that level of frequency we in many ways didn't expect. This image on the far right is some really groundbreaking work that Mike Stanbaugh did in the Southeast, showing sub-annual or biannual fire. So in the fire scar record, showing multiple fires at a single tree in a single year, bucking this sort of idea that fires occurred at a pretty high frequency, but not at such a frequency that's now not only been recorded there, but recorded in multiple locations across the region. So many of the areas in the Southeast, and indeed this area of the Red Hills where we work and where that image is from in the middle, you're all aware of Smokey Bear's impact in the United States on changing attitudes, but also changing activities on the landscape. This general shift to fire suppression, these areas were somewhat immune from it and continued to burn during those periods. The broad question that Marc and Paulo started to chip away at is sort of, why do we burn? Why do these individual regions burn, or these countries burn? And in the Southeast, as well as broadly in the United States, it's a pretty high diversity of answers. There's some categorization at the federal level for prescribed fires, but the way we categorize the rationale for an individual burn is somewhat arbitrary. It's based on funding and other mechanisms that tend to mask what the actual reasons are. And so there's often wildfire hazard reduction is listed as a primary objective for prescribed fire, and almost as often endangered species management. Many of the endangered or threatened and endangered animals, particularly in the Southeast, have a requirement for really frequent fire. And so using fire to manipulate their habitat is often a primary objective. More broadly speaking, wildlife habitat is often cited, but is almost always either, if not a number one, but a number two as an objective. Fire is used in silviculture in the Southeast, increasingly in other areas of the country. And I'm often surprised just how much burning takes place for aesthetics. Many of these landscapes are recreational lands, whether that recreation is hunting or is hiking or backpacking. Fire tends to be used in those landscapes quite a bit. And so landscapes like this to the right, we could assign a single reason why they burn, but in general, we know that those reasons are pretty diverse. Major drivers, as I mentioned, a lot of that can be endangered species. A few of the most charismatic fauna of the Southeast tend to drive a lot of fire behavior, whether those are the endangered red-cockaded woodpecker or other species that not only benefit, but in many ways require frequent fire for their habitat and for the perpetuation of those species. Major beneficiary tends to be really high plant diversity. The Southeast and the upland pine savannas and woodlands are noted for their outrageous understory plant species richness. 40 to 45 species per square meter, are sort of the records that people talk about. I'm always struck that when we talk about 20 species per square meter in these ecosystems, people are pretty disappointed, which I think is a great indicator of just how much diversity these landscapes bear. The most common taxa across the southeastern sites, the most common genera are the grasses, legumes, and asters. And so these systems tend to have a fall flourish of activity. The Southeast in particular is notable for the fire adapted traits and just how common they are in the flora. If you were blindfolded and dropped into North Florida or southwestern Georgia, it'd be relatively easy for people from around the world to understand just how fire adapted this floral region is, with species that have very odd juvenile stages that can survive fire, species that accrue bark at a relatively miraculous rate, and rapid vegetation recovery. This picture here is of an aristida, southern wiregrass, only 2 days after a prescribed fire, showing you just how rapidly these species respond and how tightly queued they are to this long history of fire. People often list, like I just did a couple of slides ago, the multiple species that are drivers for fire. If you remember back to that, something like 84% of prescribed fire being on private lands, the overwhelming dominance of the Southeast, and taking a glance at both that private lands map from that Karen Cummins paper, as well as the clock, it really shows the really disproportionate impact of northern bobwhite or bobwhite quail that was in that earlier image and is the image here. Where we live and work in North Florida, quail season ends March 1st, and they begin nesting in early May. It's not a coincidence that clock of timing of burning reflects that disproportionate impact. Hearing Paulo's description of the grouse lands in the British Isles, we see this really across the world where people are burning for objectives, and so it shouldn't surprise us that that burning fits their calendars and often not ours. I wanted to show you about 50 slides of beautiful southeastern ecosystems and other ecosystems across the United States where prescribed fire is taking place, but this is one of my favorites. This is a location in South Georgia whose contemporary fire history really closely matches the fire scar evidence as well as our understanding of these landscapes. And to people that live in the southeastern United States, this site is somewhat uncommon. As you saw in that map, there are certain hotspots of prescribed fire activity, and there are also hotspots of both biodiversity and these relatively rare ecosystems. I will not totally overlook the West. I spent half my career there, spent a lot of my time there, but we're going through right now, I think maybe the most exciting prescribed fire story in the United States is this Western rekindling, whether on public, private, or tribal lands, really an unprecedented funding and attention from Washington, D.C. on prescribed fire across the West. Regardless of the federal agency, a pretty tremendous change is happening right now. And so if we're having this conversation a decade from now, I think I could increase the importance of Western public lands much more. Just as exciting is the focus on private lands in the West, something overlooked in a lot of large strategies. Private lands dominate the Southeast, and I think private lands in the West offer a lot of promise because they are showing the passion that individual people have and communities becoming engaged in prescribed fire instead of being the subject of the insults of wildfire. The California Prescribed Burn Association movement, as the Prescribed Burn Association movement is across the United States and Oklahoma and the Southeast, is just inspiring. And I think that's a really neat version and approach that America is taking right now that I think is really quite interesting. There are lots of reforms of state laws that the focus in the United States on increasing prescribed fire is at a really rare moment. We also face a tremendous number of challenges. That was part of the instruction to talk about challenges, and I don't want to be a downer at the end of my presentation, but there are quite a few challenges. From a private lands perspective, again, the most dominant portion of prescribed fire, there's a real threat from insurance rates. If burners and contractors don't have insurance or can't afford insurance, they're not going to perform in these settings. And so this has become almost overnight a dramatic issue where premiums have increased by an order of magnitude. And so this is really challenging the expansion of prescribed fire. At the same time, for wonderful, well-meaning reasons, America has continued to tighten restrictions on air quality, and in particular this year, just recently, on particulate matter, the finest particulate matter, airborne soot. And that has clear implications for prescribed fire, particularly in places that lack a technology infrastructure. And so we're working quite a bit to balance public health and prescribed fire necessity. And then we've known for a while that the future workforce of prescribed fire will be different than the former workforce. And it really has started to highlight a few of relatively long-standing inequities in American education. The place in higher education where fire management, or where, if we'd call it stewardship, is taught, tends to be in primarily white, large land-grant institutions, the wealthiest of the public institutions, leaving behind a lot of future practitioners and really affecting how lands are managed. So America faces a real challenge now in how to train and how to educate the future workforce. We have the National Interagency Prescribed Fire Training Center that's making great efforts and strides in that way, and the training exchanges across the Western United States that are making similar, I think, very inspiring changes. Just as prescribed fire across the country is not monolithic in its extent, in how we look at where prescribed fire is going in the future, we can see, unfortunately, recent declines. Several of these states in that darkest blue color are places where You've seen a 10%, we've observed a 10% increase in the extent of prescribed fire. They're pretty easy to see in this map because there's so few of them. The places, unfortunately, in the light blue color are places where prescribed fire is decreased by 10%. You can see that in both the heart of prescribed fire in the southeast, where Georgia, South Carolina, and Louisiana are decreasing. But you also see it in places where there's been tremendous investments in policy change and in straight up resources like Oregon, Idaho, and Montana. And so we're starting to see this troubling pattern play out. Okay. What I'll close on is this sort of looking forward. As we're thinking about the future, went through a bunch of challenges. We're all equally depressed now. I'm pretty heartened right now because of what I see as relatively rare collaborations that are real. A lot of people talk about prescribed fire, and in a lot of ways you figure out how much prescribed fire takes place and where they are. Fire is as we all know, is a place-based phenomenon. It's an ecology of place. And what we're seeing in places like South Georgia and North Florida is this rare, and hopefully will become less rare in the future, these communities of practice build up between the land management communities and between public health. And, I think from a prescribed fire standpoint, it's always been, at least in the United States, it's always been in the back of our mind that air quality would be a problem, but it's not right now. And so we'll just continue on the way in doing business as usual. And I think we're seeing some of those massive changes. And I think that's going to be required in places where prescribed fire is relatively rare, but the push is there to increase it. And so I look forward to talking to you about that in the future as well. And I'll close there. Thank you, Ruth.
Thank you, Morgan. Can you listen to me now? Yeah.
We can.
Yeah, okay. So sorry, Morgan, I couldn't introduce you. Thank you for this nice perspective of America. And well, Morgan is a fire ecologist and the director of research of Tall Timbers, and I'm sure that most of you already know him. So thank you. Now we will move into the last speaker, Luisa Alfaro. And just remember that we have activated the translation. Let's see if it works. So the ones that you want the translation will have to activate there. You have to go down to the translation. So Luisa, she's from the United States Agency for International Development, the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance in Costa Rica. She's been working on connecting and empowering communities to confront the wildfire challenge. Indigenous and rural communities, as well as fire services in South America, is an unknown world that never stopped using fire. So, Luisa, why do we know so little about that? Luisa, ¿por qué sabemos tan poco de lo que pasa aquí en Sudamérica?
Gracias y buenos días, buenas tardes, buenas noches a todos la audiencia que nos está escuchando. Yo quiero compartir tal vez un poco de lo que realmente nos pasa en América Latina y dónde estamos. Después de escuchar las otras ponencias, uno se da cuenta que hay cosas todavía que nos faltan, pero hay esfuerzos importantes que está haciendo la región de América Latina en entender el fuego como tal. La región como tal, si lo vemos, el uso del fuego en la región nuestra ha sido desde nuestros antepasados. Nuestras comunidades indígenas han utilizado el fuego tanto para la parte de actos, de la parte ritual, el manejo de la tierra, para la agricultura, el control de plagas, la gestión del combustible. Desde esos tiempos ancestrales hemos usado el fuego. En los últimos tiempos, bueno, el fuego se ha venido utilizando para lo que es pastos autóctonos y en la ganadería extensiva es bastante muy común que se utiliza tanto en Brasil, Paraguay, Uruguay, de los países, Argentina, la parte del uso del fuego como tal. Tenemos toda la parte, el uso del fuego para quema de lo que son de rastrojos, plagas, mala hierba, que se utiliza en algunos de los países como tal. La parte de la deforestación es una parte de donde se deforesta, se quema y no se utiliza nada de eso que deforestamos. Es a veces un poco triste y frustrante cuando uno llega a ver sitios donde se bota el bosque, donde no hay un aprovechamiento de nada en ese sentido, y lo que hacen es quemar nada más. Y el cambio, el otro del uso del fuego es para cambiar el uso del suelo como tal. Entonces, y pues hay otros escenarios, pero es en sí más o menos es en forma muy general de lo que se está usando el fuego en la región como tal. Si vemos, América Latina es una región que todo el año pasamos con fuego. Tenemos países que tienen hasta 2 temporadas de incendios forestales. Entonces, el fuego está con nosotros todo el año, en diferentes meses, en diferentes épocas del año. Entonces, hay un movimiento grande en la región. Tenemos los programas que en América Latina iniciamos con el concepto de manejo integral del fuego, el uso del fuego. Si lo vemos, es reciente, si uno compara con otros países en el mundo. Los países más antiguos es Chile, Argentina, que inician en los años 70. Si vemos, es un programa que anda por unos 50 años de trabajo como tal. Tenemos en el caso México, Brasil, Honduras, Costa Rica, Cuba, inician toda la parte de entender la parte del comportamiento del fuego en los años 80, 90. Y el resto, Nicaragua, Guatemala, Panamá, vamos, todos estos países de 1900 a 2010 que se instalan los programas de manejo del fuego en la región. Entonces, si vemos, hay unos países que han desarrollado una mayor experiencia, pero tenemos otros países que apenas están evolucionando en la parte del manejo del fuego y aprendiendo y buscando cómo desarrollar algunos, entender cómo se comporta el fuego en algunos de sus ecosistemas como tal. Si vemos en cuanto a la historia de lo que hay, la región ha desarrollado una serie de leyes, políticas, programas, estrategias nacionales, planes, formación de personal, acuerdos bilaterales, conformación de grupos de expertos también para entender un poco el comportamiento del fuego y poder definir algunas normativas que puedan darnos. Si uno ve los países en estos años, a pesar de las políticas que se dieron, fue el no uso del fuego. Esto nos ha hecho como permitirnos realmente la dificultad de usar el fuego, porque las políticas que se dieron y las legislaciones que se dieron en los últimos 30 años y algunos desde 1934, como en el caso de Brasil, estaba la prohibición de uso del fuego para todo. Hay países que tenemos normativas que hasta para la agricultura está prohibido el uso del fuego. Entonces, esto es un cambio realmente que tendrán que hacer los países latinoamericanos y las autoridades para poder cambiar y aprender a usar el fuego. Hace algunos años algunas normativas se fueron dando en la región, pero realmente hoy día cuando uno revisa las legislaciones, de nuestros países está el no uso del fuego como tal. En la región, a partir de 2006, se dan una serie de acciones en cuanto a la parte de poder entender nuestros ecosistemas y buscar una forma de cómo funciona el fuego en la región y a ver que habían ecosistemas que necesitaban hacer uso del fuego y otros ecosistemas que no podíamos hacer, son más críticos en cuanto al uso del fuego. Y ahí se da un paso que fue al trabajar con el manejo integrado del fuego y hacer una serie de estrategias que permitieran entender realmente un poco más nuestros ecosistemas en la región como tal. Encontramos ecosistemas, dentro de estos ecosistemas que eran dependientes del fuego y que necesitaban, y encontramos en México, en toda Centroamérica, Guatemala, Belice, Honduras, República Dominicana, con especies que sí eran dependientes del fuego. En el caso del Brasil, teníamos la parte del cerrado, que es donde más ha trabajado Bolivia. En Perú encontramos los llanos en Venezuela. Entonces, esta parte de poder entender estos ecosistemas ha sido una parte fundamental para que los países pudieran hacer uso de estas herramientas, de poder hacer más trabajo en lo que es la quema prescrita. Y todavía estamos aprendiendo. Habían países que dieron un avance. El caso de Honduras, que recuerdo hace unos 30 años, había todo un programa de manejo del fuego, pero después las mismas normativas que dieron un atraso y no la legislación prohibía uso del fuego. Entonces, hoy están volviendo algunos de estos países a volver a cómo usar el fuego en la parte de plantaciones, en la parte de algunas áreas protegidas, cómo usarlo realmente y poder entender realmente el manejo del fuego como tal. Si vemos en cuanto a esta parte de las políticas, y como les decía, en estos años, en 2000, los años 80, 90, al 2010, la región hubo mucha reforestación con especies dependientes del fuego. Y tal vez nuestros políticos no, ahora es una parte más difícil de poder cambiar y decir, necesitamos hacer este manejo del fuego. Teníamos legislaciones que prohibían el uso del fuego, como lo mencioné anteriormente. Algunos países normaron el uso del fuego, pero para la parte agrícola y ganadera, en ese sentido. Entonces, toda la que era la parte del uso del fuego en las plantaciones de caña de azúcar, la parte ganadera, había en la parte de cereales, realmente ahí se hizo más la normativa para hacer uso del fuego como tal y aprender, porque también igual los azucareros sufrían en el uso del fuego también, porque si sus plantaciones no estaban en el momento de su cosecha y les prendían, estas gente perdían realmente inversiones económicas muy fuertes en la parte agrícola como tal. Entonces, esto llevó a a normalizar en muchos de los países de la región un poco de la parte del uso del fuego en ese sentido como tal. Si vemos muchas áreas protegidas, hubo una prohibición del uso del fuego en áreas protegidas, entonces tampoco teníamos masas muy grandes donde no tenían ningún tratamiento y muchos lugares estaban acercándose mucho las poblaciones como tal. Teníamos lo que se introduce vino una etapa de lo que eran el pago de servicios ambientales hacia muchas poblaciones en muchos países. Esto vino a hacer un cambio también, a que la gente quisiera trabajar más la conservación de estos bosques y la parte que se hicieron mucho, lo que fue por las políticas de cambio climático y normas que tenían que cumplirse los países como tal en la región en ese sentido. ¿Qué nos llevó a esto? Podemos decir lo que fue el manejo del fuego con un enfoque que iba hacia conocer más la ecología, sus beneficios, sus efectos que tenía, como la parte de la cultura del fuego, qué impactos conflictos podríamos tener, y la parte del manejo propiamente del fuego, desde un punto de vista de prevención, no supresión y el uso. En esto la región esta ha sido como la parte filosófica de toda la región de trabajar bajo estos ejes. Y durante estos años, tal vez mucho de este triángulo realmente la supresión ha llevado una carga muy grande y todavía uno siente todos los otros en el manejo mismo, la prevención, el uso del fuego, tal vez estamos un poco más atrasados en la región, entender la parte cultural del fuego como tal, es una parte que se ha venido trabajando, pero todavía falta mucho por hacer, y la parte de la ecología para ver esos ecosistemas que son más sensibles, poderlos entender y los impactos que están sufriendo muchos de los ecosistemas como tal. Algunos ecosistemas, como lo vemos, Brasil, Argentina, Paraguay, Bolivia, durante los últimos años hemos tenido realmente sequías muy fuertes que han producido escenarios muy impactantes en la región como tal. Y es una parte de estas enseñanzas de lo que hemos también entender, porque es una parte difícil a veces con estos escenarios que se tienen, el poder hacer uso del fuego. Desde el punto de vista político de los medios de comunicación, donde muchas veces la toma de decisiones para poder detener un incendio es hacer uso del fuego, uno tiene que trabajar muchas veces con los medios de comunicación, dando charlas dentro de la misma emergencia, por qué se va a hacer uso del fuego como tal. Entonces, este es algo de lo que estamos viviendo la gente que trabajamos operativamente en el campo. Dentro de los tipos, y hoy día la región, los escenarios que tenemos son muy complejos para realmente ir enfrentando y aprendiendo todos los días. Cada año hay un escenario diferente, nuevo, que cada vez que trabajamos esas lecciones aprendidas, qué aprendimos, qué tenemos que mejorar o qué tenemos que cambiar, nos enfrentamos a nuevos escenarios. Y esta es una parte que a veces dificulta realmente el poder trabajar más en esta parte de quemas preventivas, cómo podemos reducir estos combustibles, cómo poderlos manejar y poder trabajar en lo que los otros expositores mostraron, hacer trabajos más de prevención y poder tener grupos más especializados para trabajar la parte de quemas prescritas como tal. Si vemos, estos son escenarios que hemos tenido: 2017 con una tormenta de fuego, tenemos 2019 con un incendio de grandes proporciones, como fue en el caso de Bolivia, un incendio que más de 1 millón de hectáreas él solo con 6 megaincendios grandes, que nos enseñaba que solo el uso del fuego podíamos detener para poder salvar más de 5 millones de hectáreas en la parte agrícola, ganadera y poblaciones que podían estar que podían sufrir impacto como tal. Entonces, esto es una parte de aprendizaje y convencimiento para una autoridad el tomar decisiones de hacer uso del fuego también durante las emergencias. Sentar a un ministro, explicarle por qué necesitábamos final, porque era la única forma que teníamos de poder atender esa emergencia como tal. No es fácil. Cuando usted le dice a un ministro hay que quemar 231,000 hectáreas para poder detener ese incendio como tal, pero tú vas a salvar 5 millones de hectáreas. Entonces, esto es un trabajo de los nuevos escenarios que venimos de vivir de Chile, un incendio sumamente complejo, con un nuevo escenario, realmente también nos hace pensar el trabajo que tenemos que hacer con nuestras comunidades en sí, el trabajo de cómo trabajar ciertas zonas más cercanas a estos ecosistemas que están cercanos a nuestras ciudades como tal. Tenemos la parte que se ha venido trabajando, en la parte de más de cambio del combustible como tal, en algunas zonas, el uso de quemas prescritas como tal, las plantaciones, algunos países están haciendo el uso del fuego, en lo que es la parte de la gestión en las zonas territoriales como tal. Realmente la región está haciendo esfuerzo en aprender a hacer uso del fuego como tal. Esas alianzas de trabajo con la empresa privada en los países que están reforestando y teniendo grandes reforestaciones con especies que necesitan del fuego como tal. Entonces, esto en la región hoy día es un aprendizaje como tal. Realmente uno ve, nos falta mucho que aprender y mucho en este trabajo a nivel de la parte política para poder que puedan comprender que se requiere hacer uso del fuego como tal. En la parte cultural es también que nuestras comunidades también puedan entender realmente el trabajo, el poder tener esa preparación de aprender a convivir con el fuego, de ser comunidades más resilientes, también adaptadas al fuego como tal. Este es un trabajo que se está haciendo a nivel de la región. De la región hay muchos proyectos en comunidades para que puedan ser comunidades más resilientes en ese sentido. Venimos trabajando en evacuación, aprender cómo evacuar si la comunidad se produce algo en la comunidad, a cómo manejar, a cómo ellos pueden protegerse como tal, a construir, y es un involucramiento que se ha tenido muchas veces, no desde la familia, no es solo los adultos, no, es como el niño, desde el niño participa con su familia para poder entender y aprender sobre el momento del fuego. Algunas descripciones de fuego, sí, están haciendo con algunas en poder, como hemos hecho un tema en un parque nacional en Costa Rica, donde tenemos parcelas que todos los años se queman y luego otras no se queman, para poder también ver el impacto de lo que está ocurriendo en la comunidad. Los soldados, que es la parte más, tal vez de más trabajo en los últimos años, en el caso de Brasil, que vienen haciendo junto con Bolivia, vienen trabajando las quemas prescritas en estos ecosistemas, tratando de aprender y entender y han logrado dentro de sus normativas poder hacer uso del fuego dentro de áreas protegidas como tal, cosa que no todos los países de la región todavía no lo permiten hacer como tal. Si vemos los países a nivel, deben de revisar si se necesita dentro de los requerimientos que los países puedan revisar sus marcos legales para permitir un manejo más y uso del fuego y fomentar en las comunidades a ser más resilientes y adaptadas al fuego, a fortalecer los principios de metodologías para utilizar el fuego y obtener beneficios económicos, sociales y ambientales como tal. Las comunidades académicas deben de seguir brindando realmente más apoyo para entender mejor los ecosistemas y abordar estos nuevos desafíos y escenarios de uso del fuego como tal. Y necesitamos continuar fortaleciendo esas alianzas de los gobiernos y el sector privado y el desarrollo de programas que nos permitan hacer más uso del fuego como tal. En la implementación de nuevas tecnologías, realmente no todas las regiones tienen para detección, diagnóstico, comportamiento de la parte meteorológica que nos ayude a en la parte del uso del fuego. Todavía hay muchas deficiencias que tenemos en la región que tenemos que evolucionar hacia esa parte. La parte de integrar nuevas herramientas para mejorar la planificación, la gestión del paisaje, es una parte que es necesario trabajar en la región. Y una parte que es la parte de fortalecimiento de las estructuras de los programas de manejo del fuego en la región. Cuando uno escuchaba más estos grupos especializados, todavía no los tienen. Entender que en la región muchos de los programas, la responsabilidad operativa se les ha entregado a los cuerpos de bomberos como tal. Entonces, esto para nosotros hay una dificultad en esa parte, porque muchas veces no podemos, los cuerpos de bomberos tienen muchas responsabilidades y esos son los que dan la respuesta muchas veces a la atención de los incendios. Pero hay grupos, hay instituciones que han cambiado su normativa más de directriz de poder trabajar con un servicio forestal, tener, si lo vemos en la región del más fuerte, es Chile, o de Honduras, en México, son las instituciones que más tienen esa separación de poder trabajar más Brasil, la parte de lo que son las quemas prescritas y poder prescribir. ¿Qué es necesario? Sí es necesario. Creo que toda América Latina debemos de evolucionar a tener programas más fuertes hacia un cambio en el manejo de los combustibles, porque es muy difícil los escenarios que estamos teniendo, poder manejar y poder realmente subsistir si no hay un cambio hacia el uso del fuego y el trabajar más lo que es entender y manejar más realmente muchos ecosistemas que requieren de uso del fuego. Gracias.
Thank you. Thank you, Luisa. Yes, so Tara, we will move now on to some questions.
Yes, we have a few questions in the Q&A and one in the chat. So everyone, please make sure you check the Q&A for questions that have been answered in text. But now we'll do a few live. For Marc, have any of the mechanical treatments in your area involved biomass removal? So as opposed to leaving slash and biomass on site?
Yeah, when I was talking about the treatment and burning, so if we do treat and leave the biomass as slash or masticated product in the ground is when we create that high intensity that affects really bad the soil and the cross regeneration. If we remove the biomass, then that effect is not there, it's good enough. So if you has the economy to remove the biomass, then what you do is just create safe pruning. But what you will have is still not create much effects on the crown layout. That will not be there. But for the soil, will be a lot safer.
Okay, thank you. And for Paulo, are there efforts to update the European burn prescription handbook for changing climatic and fuel conditions?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a good question. Never had thought about that. The book is mostly a compilation of practices. So we compiled what people do or did, because it was in 2010, I think. So I guess if under change conditions, if the practice change, so people will feel the need of having a modified set of prescriptions. Probably windows of opportunity to burn will change, presumably will be lower, but I'm not totally sure about that. It depends on climate type. Anyway, maybe prescriptions will have to be broader to accommodate these new conditions and to maintain the opportunities to burn. The fuels may also change. So in certain regions, because of increased fuel aridity, we will have less fuel load. And so the need to burn maybe will also change. So it's complicated, and I guess we will have to wait for the future to see what will happen.
Okay, well, getting at one of the more specific challenges of this question for Paulo and Luisa, how do air quality regulators and public sentiment around air quality impact the ability to achieve desired levels of prescribed fire across Europe and Latin America? Maybe Morgan could also weigh in for the US.
Well, in Europe, as far as I know, currently, no one really cares about air quality or smoke, because our practice, the scale, as you have seen, is low. Very often it's in mountains, away from people, away from roads. But I know some people, of course, take care or precautions if they are burning near towns or near roads. And so, for example, near highways, and so they will burn on days with adequate wind direction, for example. But it's not really a relevant thing. But I know that, for example, in France, because that's where they burn more and they have concentration of fire in certain days or weeks of the year, if they have some atmospheric conditions that maintain the smoke in the valleys, local people will complain. And so this social pressure is relevant but maybe that's something really specific of France, because that's the only case that I've heard of about problems with smoke.
In the US, go ahead.
Ok, en el caso de la pregunta de América Latina, si yo estoy optimista, yo creo que sí tengo un optimismo, porque hay voluntad de algunas instituciones y la gente en la preparación que está teniendo a nivel de la región. En el caso, estamos viendo países que ahorita están formando la alianza en la parte amazónica de hacer manejo del fuego. Entonces, está sentando a las autoridades poder buscar cada país, como el caso de Perú, donde está prohibido el uso del fuego, hasta en la parte agrícola hay algunas normativas hace poco que revisaban y ellos estaban trabajando en cómo un país que acaba de hacer el convenio entre todo el grupo amazónico para trabajar la parte de uso del fuego como tal. Vemos como un Chile está trabajando y reactivando todo lo que es la parte consciente en uso del fuego. Vemos un Honduras hoy día, después de haber dejado por años de hacer la parte de quemas prescritas, volviendo a hacer uso del fuego en algunas zonas donde tienen grandes acumulaciones de combustibles. Creo que podemos lograr un cambio, que las legislaciones hay que cambiarlas, sí. Y creo que América Latina tiene que pensar en un cambio en esta parte de sus legislaciones. Es fundamental, tuvimos muchos años. Yo recuerdo cuando comencé en el programa, decirle a un ministro, hay fuegos buenos, hay fuegos malos, y el ministro decía, no, ningún fuego es bueno, todos son malos, pero realmente el tiempo nos enseña a un cambio y tenemos que evolucionar. ¿Por qué? Porque si vemos toda la parte de la migración de las poblaciones, cómo se están moviendo nuestras poblaciones, con todo, realmente si no hay un manejo del fuego, al final las que van a sufrir son muchos de nuestras comunidades. Entonces, ¿por qué? Porque los escenarios son cada día más complejos. ¿Por qué? Porque hay mucha acumulación de combustibles. Si uno ve esta gran acumulación, si no la aprendemos a manejar, los escenarios nadie los puede parar. Estos escenarios que estamos teniendo en muchos de los países son muy difíciles y no hay recursos, supera todas las capacidades que podamos tener en la región comunitaria.
Well, I now want to turn to a related question, which is all the speakers addressed to some extent the role of culture and public perception in the application or rekindling of fire stewardship. So this is a question for all speakers. How do you see local fire agencies or institutions engaging the humanities or social sciences in addressing issues of public perception in your integrated fire plans? So maybe we could start with Luisa and go to Morgan, Paulo, and then Marc. Or anyone can jump in.
Well, I can jump in. So it is critical that we as a local agencies and engage with the community. The only way you can get the program rolling is if you communicate, you involve them in the preparing the decision of if we do burn or we do not burn, and why we do burn. And that's why mainly you are focused as an agency to manage fuel, but then you enroll the people in your community, and they have other goals like pastures or biodiversity or protection of the vulnerable interface. So you end up with a more broader program than the one you were focusing. But doing so, you ensure support for your program. And then you need to involve research. Involving research, it means you can provide clear information. That's what Paulo said, and I support, and that's the role of this database in California, just monitoring, following, just learning the outcomes of the burns and being able to answer those questions. So the only way to expand burning is just convincing our society. That's what we need to do. It cannot be imposed, and sometimes from the state agencies, it's what we need to do. But without informing the public, it will not work. And that's what we've learned through the years. It's basic. The first thing before putting a smoke in the air, it is go and talk to the people. If you do that, probably they will accept it. If you don't do that, then they will complain, and then you will have constraint on your burden.
Just echo Marc's in the Southeast, we see in general, communication, but a lot deeper than that, trying to understand society's interaction with prescribed fire, and that is primarily around smoke. So these two questions are in some ways related. We try through a number of means to be brutally honest with our local communities that there will be a period of smoky skies, and but that it generates all these other benefits. What they want to know through all of our inquiries is, what we're doing and why. And I think each of the presenters talked about the sort of why. At a really base level, there's an idea that we're burning for agriculture or to dispose of forestry debris, which is on the spectrum of two of the rarest reasons we would burn. And so when we talk about why we burn, and we're burning for biodiversity and for public health outcomes and for the public benefit, it really resonates. And I think we've become brutally honest with the communities through working with social science researchers on this topic. That question gets at, one of fires and prescribed fire is in this. One of our issues that we have been a very macho community, whether it's a wildfire and you're saving a community, or a prescribed fire and you're doing really difficult work, instead of communicating with the community and being engaged. And I think we've gone from an adversarial period in the southeastern U.S. to a much more partnership idea. And I know that as we expand prescribed fire in the West, that starting off on the best foot, being as proactive and as honest as possible as we expand prescribed fire is going to be necessary for any sort of lasting success. It's a great question.
If I can jump in, just an example. One of the policies we applied in the early days when we were burning, just the day of the burn, after all the communication, after everything, we just were sending one of our firefighters into the coffee shop in the near town and into the bar. Those areas is where the people talk about the smoke in the air, what's going on. And if you are there, you can provide a clear history of what's going on. If not, a lot of rumors will start and the community can get their own picture. So using as an information official, one of the firefighters in the coffee shop, in the market, in the bar, it was one of the tools we used in the early days.
Yeah. So I'm sorry, we are too long, so we have to stop the meeting now. Thank you, everybody.